I'm not in the race equality game. I come to this by documenting arcane British history. I convened this conference because I had so many contributors say that racism had fallen off the agenda. So that was the reason for this conference. And I thought it useful to convene a meeting to discuss this. You know that the title of the conference has a question mark. The whole project called Look How Far We've Come has a question mark. We're quite open, and indeed tonight I'm expecting we should be open to diverse views, yeah? If we want to move along. It's a reminder that all voices are welcome. Have a good conference, and if you believe race is off the agenda, let's come up with ways to get it back on the agenda. And more importantly, ways of vigilantly monitoring procedures. It's great to have the procedures. If there are no monitors, it's of no benefit. I thank you.
Absolutely. I'll be a little contrary. Getting racism on the agenda, I'm sure you all agree, cannot be an end in itself. An item does not necessarily need to be on the agenda to be discussed. Indeed, some items that are not on the agenda are discussed under AOB. It is also the case that some items that are on the agenda are not discussed because there's insufficient time, or they are not discussed with the seriousness they deserve. The first Race Relations Act of 1965 was put on the agenda by the Labour government as a consequence of activism, including the 1963 Bristol bus boycott. So what is my point? My point is that it is important to articulate what it is that we want to see arise from putting racism on the agenda. I believe we would like to see a more equal playing field, an environment where people are treated with the same standards by schools, police officers, housing and health authorities, and in the workplace, regardless of the color of their skin. We would like to see more people getting jobs based on skills, qualifications, and competence, and the removal of the glass ceiling. How can this be achieved? We can discuss possible strategies to combat racism and discrimination, regardless of whether or not race is on the agenda. The challenge will be the implementation of solutions or strategies by the authorities, or the passing of legislation where necessary. But even if race is on the agenda and possible solutions and strategies are put forward, does this necessarily mean that they will be implemented?
Justice might mean now. And I've written a short piece in this programme, which you should read. But what it refers to is the problem with measurement. This notion that we are able to, in a scientific and objective way, measure how far we've moved on racism. I think it's a bit of a. I think we will really struggle to deliver on that. And one of the classic moves of the racist, or at least the person who doesn't want to see change, is to send you back for more information. How many times have you been there and said, okay, so here's the data, and so we should act in this way as a result of that data? And they say, well, that data's not quite good enough. Even to the extent of, I've got a friend who has a different experience, therefore your data is somehow corrupt. So I think we should be careful about how data is used and how data can be used against a movement for progressive change, as opposed to in favour of one. So I've left an organisation which I think is doing some amazing work, left it to some other people to take it forward. But I've left after 5 years feeling pretty exhausted. For three reasons. Firstly, money. Really difficult to raise money to work on an issue like race and racism, partly because you can raise money for donkey sanctuaries much more easily than you can raise money for addressing a problem which people have to reflect on personally and has an impact in their lives. Secondly, because of the breadth and the breadth of issues and the depth of the challenge of all of those issues. as some of the speakers were saying earlier in that film, it's clear that all racisms are local. All patterns diverge between different places, and people have very different experiences based on generation, heritage, etc. And it's made it very difficult to have a very clear message about race and racism in this country. It's very, I think our political leaders in particular quite like that confusion, because it means you can simply say, well, it's not racism, is it, if Chinese children are doing well and African Caribbean children aren't. But I think that finding ways of addressing that complexity was another thing that was really exhausting. And finally, what was really exhausting was the range of voices that were raised against progress in terms of racial justice. Kwaku has mentioned this post-racial myth. Certainly since 2008, we've seen this myth gain some credence in the public field. And what it's led to is this real failure in empathy, where in some of the surveys that we've done, 75% of the black African respondents were saying government must do more to address patterns of racial inequality in our society. But only 15% of the white respondents to that same survey thought the government should be doing more. Similarly, there's this notion that racism is not systemic.
You have in the booklet a sort of considered short piece with footnotes. If I may speak slightly to the side of that and make a few points. The question is whether or not race is on the agenda, and my question is, whose agenda are we referring to? My question is our future, our destiny in our hands, or do we see our future, our destiny in the hands of others? So when we say there aren't enough black MPs in Parliament, do we see that as somebody else's problem? Or do we see that as something that challenges us? Second thing I want to say is that racism is embedded in Western culture, and the sooner we accept that as a fact, the better we will feel. Now, this doesn't mean that every white person is racist, or is a racist. Some are, but it certainly means, in my view, that Western structures are racist. They were not built for people like me. Forms of prejudice, oppression, and so forth also are to be found in every society where human beings are. And so I think there's a question about to what extent we essentialize racism as a problem all of its own type, and there is nothing else like it. And what is the result of that essentializing of race and racism? Racism, too, embedded in Western culture, is rooted in vested interest. And those vested interests are not going to shift through special pleadings, through me cozying up to the power brokers. Power only understands power. Racism has to be overcome, in my view, and that's another thought that I share with you today that is probably not down Main Street, not necessarily eradicated from society. I don't often hear us saying, vile as pedophilia is, that we hope one day that it will be, well, we hope, but that we think realistically we will be able to squeeze it out of society. What we do is we make laws that will bring people to book who commit those crimes. I'm not quite sure why we think racism is different and that somehow it is an honorable pursuit to eradicate it from society. And therefore, that is not a journey that I am personally on. But then if it is there and present with us, embedded in structures, question is how do we deal with it? How do we prosper, like the scripture says, spread a table before me in the presence of my enemies. How do I prosper even in its teeth? Well, first of all, I am a supporter of strong anti-racist laws. Anybody who messes with me should feel and bear the consequences. And if there aren't adequate laws there, a thump in the mouth from me is possibly something that they're going to feel as well. So racism should not be without its consequences. And the first bit of that, dealing with it, since it is with us structurally, is strong anti-racist laws. As somebody said in one of the pieces, we are not doing too bad in this country, but we are certainly not in the promised land.
You know, I didn't know when I arrived in Britain, I was ashamed of my colour. I thought God was white. And as black, I was a beast of burden, like everybody of my kind, to suffer and to serve white colonialism. And then I studied history and discovered when the Roman Emperor invaded Britain and conquered the tribes in 43 AD, there's one tribe he couldn't conquer, and that was the Silurists. He described them as black people with thick lips and curly hair. And it was us, was our ancestors. They come from fighting people that resist suffering and oppression. And you know, we've been in Britain for over 2,000 years. And the struggle we have had always been one of fighting. Fighting, but that fight is always better when we're united. Always better when we're united. So I joined the trade union movement. I wrote a book in 1984. I was one of the first black officials with Bernie Grant in 1976 and Bill Morris in about the same year. And in 78 I became a GMB London official. And I saw racism. I saw tokenism. I saw careerists and opportunists hanging around the trade union movement, say things what the white institution wanted them to hear, and they made progress. But I was one of those who said, I'm going to tell us as it is. The trade unions and the Labour Party are racist institutions, and they are to this day. And I tell you this, a lot of people would claim that they started off black self-organisation. After I wrote my book in 1984, the title was Racism Within Trade Union. And I've written 12 books since on black people and mental health, on disability, on politics, on community, and a whole range. And I brought my latest book, my 12-book copies with me, on black history. In my research, I discovered black people were in India. Africans were in India. There were emperors of Japan and China. They were in Britain before white people. I didn't know that. But I tell you, all of us need to know it. Especially the younger one with our history. We are lost. The history guides us. It tells us about our past. It explains why we are in the position we are presently, and it gives us an indication where we need to go. So self-organisation started with myself and Benny Grant in 1979. Started off an organisation called Black Trade Union Solidarity Movement. Because shop steward and union officers used to wear the National Front badge openly and vote racist. These were the people supposed to represent us, and they never did. And we set that organisation up to represent black people across the trade unions. And then we know the Labour Party was also racist. And a small number of us set up the Labour Party black section in 1983. I also stood as a parliamentary candidate then. And we built on that. Self-organisation is important. In 1983, we had our first Black Workers' Conference, and for 10 years we organised it, fund it, and manage it. And embarrass it to you see, until 10 years later, in 1993, they set up a Black Workers' Conference. And today it has no teeth, because it's emulating the White Workers' Conference. Passing motions that means nothing, and you come year in, year out, saying the same thing.
Thank you very much, Dean. On that note, just to remind you that Dr. Joe, not John, has got a book, and it talks about racism and other things. You know, he's a bishop, so he talks about other things. He's got a good blog. Check out his blog. Check out Jean's blog as well. So let me just do the rounds. We've got Sean Creighton, who's got some useful pamphlets. He's part of the Bastard group, so he's got some pamphlets. I don't know if he's got some recruit Taylor there, but he's got some pamphlets. Do check them out. Then we've got BAC, Black Cultural Archives. I'm sorry, I don't remember, but there is a store next to it. Please, they've made an effort, right? Although the delegates also support. On that end, we've got Eku with I'm an African Child. He's got posters of his poem, very powerful poem. A young girl in here. There's a YouTube video of them. And last year, quickly, Harold African History Month, one of the competitions for young people was to read that poem, and she was one of those. So it's on the YouTube. We've got Searchlight. I'm grateful that Searchlight came because I have to say this seriously. We're an African-led organization. Most of us in here are African. This is not anti-non-African. But sometimes some of the organizations that are leading the anti-racist movement is cut across color lines. And the Europeans want to lead it, and they don't want to engage with the Africans as much as they ought to. So I'm glad we've got someone like Searchlight. Searchlight is part of, what is it? United Against, are you Searchlight?
We work with United.
Yeah, that's it. They work with United Against Fascism. So fantastic literature. They do Black History Month supplements and stuff like that. So do check out Searchlight. Powerful website and what should I say? Magazine. We've got Paul. Paul has got 2 books, one on heritage, one on tracing of genealogy. So please do support it. Jim has got his book in his bag. So
I was asked to address the question, how far have we come and what should we be doing? I'll tell you, we've made great strides. I think it will be disrespectful of those who have worked in the movement to say we haven't done anything. We have made great strides. When you look at the League of Colored People in the 1930s, you look at the Bristol bus boycott in the 60s, the campaign against racial discrimination, which helped to bring in, with the bus boycott, bring in the first Race Relations Act. A lot of strides have been made for those who engaged with the Labour Party. And let's face it, the Labour Party, racist as it is, did bring in the first Race Relations Act because of the activists. So we have made great strides. But, and it's always the but, it's worth remembering that, and I'll use the words of Al Sharpton, which actually is reproduced in African Voices, another book which has been produced by Kwaku and Awula Sewa. And it's called African Voices because it's a book of African quotations. And in that book, there's a quote by Al Sharpton, Reverend Al Sharpton. And he says, and I like that quote, "We have defeated Jim Crow, but now have to fight his son, James Crow Jr. Esquire." And I think sometimes that's what people forget. It just changes its shape. And some people prefer to think it's gone away. I think recently we all saw what happened with the banana on the pitch. Kwaku has mentioned it. There was a footballer about to take a goal or a corner or whatever. I'm not a football fan, so forgive me if I don't even know the name of the team. But basically, I don't think it's important. The football fans I think the important thing is that somebody threw a banana, part of the whole gimmick, we're all monkeys, that sort of thing. He handled it in such a wonderful manner. He picked up the banana, took his time, peeled it, ate it, took the goal. I mean, talk about class. And I like that way of dealing with it. But somebody reminded me, we need to be careful. You never know. Next time they'll lace it with something. Thinking, so you can't use the same strategy. And I think that sort of demonstrates my point. You have to be astute enough to know that you're dealing with a changeable enemy. Because racism is the enemy, and you need to change your strategies for dealing with it. You remember when Lenny Henry was insulted by the UKIP man? I think the most important point of that, and I read Owen Jones's article in The Guardian, and I think that is the point. Lenny Henry's call has been forgotten. Lenny Henry was making a statement about the lack of representation of Africans and Asians in the media. That's what and in different jobs. That has been forgotten. Everybody is focusing, and I like the point that somebody made before me about words. We're focusing on the words. Oh, the guy said go to a black country. Important as it is to address that, that's not the most important point. I wish the same enthusiasm with which they were jumping on UKIP was used to jump on the issue that Lenny Henry was raising. Why is it that after all these years, we seem to have gone backwards, and representations of African and Asians in these industries, which after all dictate what we think and what we do and that sort of thing, is so non-existent. He made that point which nobody is picking up, and I think that is the tragedy. The point is the reality of institutional racism. I mean, it's interesting, we've been fighting a battle in Harrow and that's not over. But what's interesting about that is somebody said to me, my problem is I had a hard life in Europe when I was a child, and so I see racism everywhere. I mean, the funny thing is, I didn't have a hard time in Europe as a child. I am not working class. I didn't come from a working class background. I had actually a very nice life. My dad happened to be a diplomat, so, you know, build the story yourself. I didn't have a hard life, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't brought up to recognize racism, even though I didn't necessarily suffer the impact of it. Racism exists. Institutional racism, as has been said before me, is a reality. The whole structure that we are living under is controlled by inequality, whether it's class, race. It is an inequality, whether it's gender. Inequality is built into this system. You step on other people to get on. And that's how they've ruled this country for years. And racism is a big part of it. So I think we need subtle strategies to tackle subtle racism, because that's where it's moved to. It's no longer overt. There's legislation to deal with that. But there's a subtle and more insidious, as has been said before, type of racism that controls our lives. And I think the sadness is that a lot of people think, let's talk about diversity, that's the most important thing. Yeah, diversity is a good thing, I won't knock it, but that's not the point. I think we need to recognize that racism exists. Institutional racism is even worse, because the nicest people can be part of perpetuating it. Yes.
On is about community education, because one of the clearest things that I have pulled out being a counsellor for 8 years is the absolute dearth of knowledge and understanding about how
let me finish. Bring up solutions to deal with it. So dealing with the issues, whether it's a new crossfire, whether it's having supplementary schools, etc. But that would mean that actually as a community, we've actually analyzed the problem. So that's a point I'll make. The other solution that's come up is about community education. Know your neighbors, deal with things like that, but then they will realize. So, you know, this is 2014, and that's what because we only have 75 people interrupting us. Yeah, I'm happy for it. Okay, so yeah, I know.
In all three tables on both sets of issues. I'd like to hope that, because notes were taken, Kwaku and colleagues will bring all of this together with lots of facts. But I think the key issues that people were discussing was effectively a generational issue, that lots of older people have knowledge, and it has to be said that when many of us were young, there were fewer of us in this country. And therefore we tended to get to know each other. We would spot each other in meetings and say, another black person, and work together. And these days there are so many that lots of people don't make contact. So issues about how do we share knowledge and experience across our communities. What one group focused on to a significant extent, and I think was very important and significant, is that lots of people don't know how the system works. They don't know how education works, how they can intervene, how lots of things work, and that's parents. We're not just talking about the young people don't know this stuff. If parents don't know it, and I must tell you from my experience, it's not only black people who don't know how the system works. There are even more white people who don't know how the system works. And that is not a good thing for democracy or freedom or justice. So there needs to be work that has resources. One of the things from the team over there about how to ensure that we have access to it, where we know the Society of Black Lawyers can provide information and support on cases that you may want to bring. But where might a lot of those resources be brought? I heard the word app. Just because I'm technophobic doesn't mean that everybody has to be. And I believe that an app is something that could be produced even if I don't know how to use them. So there are lots of ideas about how, not just what, but how are we going to move together. I think the issue of respect, we had a bit of a discussion on that table about particularly those of us of direct African origin, in which respect for elders is mandatory, whether you like it or not. But what we have in this country today, in our black community, is lots of young people who don't have an automatic respect for elders. And that, I think we simply have to respect. But we must find a respectful way of working with those young people so that they tell us, the elders, what is happening.
Primarily it's around challenging racism in the workplace. I think it was quite clear that there needs to be solidarity and a critical mass of people within organisations. But we do understand that there are really very clear challenges, especially in the private sector. If you're working under a contract, if you start to challenge, then there's a concern about losing your job or getting some form of sanctions against you because you're underperforming, because of the blame culture that comes with it. And we've all been victims of that or seen it in some way. So it's really important that people know their rights, because I think Jim actually, I don't know if Jim's still here. Yeah. Jim actually says that, you know, they are still support, even though you might not be in a union. And another member of the workshop said, you know, you still have equality rights, whether you're on a zero contract or a job for life, even though they're very rare nowadays. I think it's only the Queen who has a job for life now. I don't know. And it's a question of getting that support and knowing where you can get that support. So that's the point that Linda was saying around the resource directory. I think it's really important, whether it's online or hard copies, and getting access to information. It's not just the Society of Black Lawyers. We in the Black Police Association are willing to support. There's the urban lawyers. They're very, very good. Especially now, there's a cut in...
Councillor Nana.
Okay, I think I had the best group. We have to be competitive, as you know. It's a political position. But I must say, I had a group that engaged really well with the topic, and we finished well ahead of time. I was very proud of that. They came up with one very good thing, that we need to build community. But we need to build community intergenerational. It takes a village to raise a child. We say that, but we need to mean it. We need to focus on young people and their experience and be respectful of it, as Linda has said. But we need to also help them to have a sense of identity, self-awareness, confidence. But we need to also realize that some of our older people need it as well. But as an African, I cannot say that without saying that building community also means learning from our elders. We need to be respectful of our elders, even though they don't share our experience. We could learn from their experiences, and we need to not act as if the elders have nothing to contribute. That would be a big mistake. They are our roots. We need to also pool resources, and I think that goes back to the starting businesses. I think that's a point that couldn't be made even more strongly. It was also about setting different priorities, because even if we are poor, we seem to find money for the £150 Nike trainers and things like that. Women, we spend a lot on our hair, that sort of thing. We need to set different priorities, which maybe prioritize economic independence. So that was something that was put quite strongly. But also what was said is that we need to deal with the issue of mistrust. Instead of skirting around the issue, we don't trust each other. We need to deal with it and put strategies in place to deal with that so that we can actually safely pool our resources and support our businesses. Because there's a way of sidestepping racism by empowering yourself.
So that was what came out quite strongly. And the third, I think, very important point is we need to learn the lessons of history, but we need to share it across all communities. It doesn't do any good to just share it amongst ourselves, because yes, we will know, we will have identity, we'll have self-awareness. We need to share it with the European communities and every single community, including the newcomers who, a lot of them, without the, say, the control of communism, are quite racist, because communism sort of kept a lid on that. We need to be aware that we need to communicate with communities outside the African and Black and Asian community.
I mean, I can actually say that I had the most passionate group of all, actually.
We'll disagree.
We'll agree to disagree. I mean, we kind of went through, I mean, our topic was actually looking at manifestations of racism. And of course, when you start on something like that, we could be here all night. So what was quite interesting is that we came up with actually 3 classifications of racism in the way that it manifested itself. The first one, which was quite surprising, it was one we didn't think would come up, but it did, was internal. And the fact that we have to deal with the issues of how we deal with racism in ourselves. So we talked about attitudes that the media influence brought about with our young people, and kind of like how some of those images that they saw actually was self-prophesying. So they would actually see those images and start believing themselves on there. We also spoke about, this is the internal classification, we also looked at the fact that there was a lack of critical thought processes in challenging racism. So there was no black consciousness classes, there was no kind of spaces where people could come together and actually deal with how we challenge racism. So that was something that led to internal manifestation of racism. Still dealing on that theme, there was this nightmare of the acceptance of diversity, which is becoming a distraction. So essentially, people thinking, well, I'm here, so I must be okay. There can be no racism because this place that I'm working at is diverse, or this school I'm at is diverse. And so that became a distraction for the real issues of institutionalized racism. We used the example of Pharrell's New Black, where one person who has broken through believes that, well, if I can break through, everyone can break through, and actually pulls up the ladder and ignores the reality that there are structural barriers to progression. And we spoke about the fact that we need a class analysis when we're dealing with situations like that, because sometimes people actually also have a leg up, sometimes have advantages, and if they don't actually use their assets and their resources to help others, then they actually are part of the racist system themselves. And the last one from the internal was about the intolerance to victims of racism. And again, that's coming from this lack of critical thought. So someone can be affected by racism, and then you have people from the same group saying, that's not racism, it's just because you did this. It's not, and there's an intolerance to accept that racism is still there. The other 2 classifications, we narrowed down to external racism and overt racism. So external racism we looked at was the overt things that happened. And I don't need to go on so much more about this. We're talking about language usage, where we see expressions of hatred. And so they're obvious expressions of people believing this ideology of racial inferiority. Media stereotypes. An example that came to mind when I was putting the notes was Channel 4 talking about the missing girls in Nigeria. And if you watch Channel 4's news, the stories on the girls, but they keep talking about corruption. No matter what, it's got nothing to do with that particular issue in this particular case. You could talk about the lack of the president in responding. You could talk about the regional disharmony. But no, it kept on coming to corruption, and so that's external diversity. And so we really are saying that we had to make sure that we own the agenda of anti-racism leading to equality, not diversity leading to equality. Thank you.
Hold on. I'm really glad you finished on this note, because you see, there's a limit to what one can say. I tried to put some of the page in the book, and I wanted to say that, but I didn't get around to saying that. Diversity and racial equality are not necessarily the same. What you do is that you put them all into one thing, and then there are other focuses. In fact, the idea of having one single equality commission, there has to be priorities. So which one are you doing? Right now, you notice, and I'm going to put this straight. We shouldn't knock the different equalities, right? Because they need their space. But the point is about priority. Right now, it seems to me, and I only focus on race here, is very much down. If you look on the government's even the equality section on the government's website, it's pretty much low down. But it takes us.
They only make it white women.
Right.
Yeah.
It takes sense.
It's only white women.
Yeah, it's always been, but it's always been, in terms of the gender, it's always been European women. We know that. But I really want to underscore the point you're doing about diversity, because, we've done an equal opportunities, we've done a diversity. It does not necessarily mean that they're engaging with racism, because there are other things. It could be age. It could be other. There are 9 protected characteristics, and they could be focused on other things. So let's know. That's why in the document it talks about multiculturalism, diversity, inclusion. They mean different things. And focus when you say race, that's why we have to look at putting race and racism.
One way of tackling racism is to get politically educated. Political literacy is important. We need to understand how we can overcome the system that is institutionally racist. We need to work together, so there's solidarity needed. We need to pool our resources. So I know you said one, but I'm giving you a number of strategies that need to all be working together to actually address the issue of racism. Thank you.
Thank you. Deal with racism or tackle it.
One way I'll tackle racism is to highlight more positive portrayals of ethnic minorities.
Tackle racism, would it be?
All right, I think I'd start with the young minds. I'd have to go into the schools and really change their perception, because even at a very young age, they get all these negative images of Africa, either starving children or, youngsters or people who can't help themselves. So I'd have to go into the schools and give them a very positive image of Africa, because I think we're being shortchanged at the moment.
Tackle or deal with racism.
Hi, I'm Andrea Encinas. I think it's important to tackle racism from a very personal point of view. It starts within your own community. I work in music and I run choirs, and I work in schools teaching gospel music. And in my choir, my adult choir, we are very mixed. I attract people from every culture, every walk of life. And it's fantastic because in that arena, real kind of transformation can happen in terms of people thinking about race and about each other, because conversation happens. And I think that's the important thing, that creating places where conversation can happen and you can be honest and open about talking about differences and similarities regarding race plus other things. So for me, that's very powerful. Conversations make a change.
One way to tackle racism, I guess tackling racism would be to talk with my friends about it, and also when I'm talking to them to also raise awareness and tell them my experience. I really haven't experienced any racism, so I can't really say much, but I'll talk to them about what their views are, and maybe with my teachers I could ask them questions and actually ask my elders questions about it instead of just watching them, and engage more and trying to have a more active role in society to deal with racism. That's it.
Thank you.
No, hang on. I need to think, because I'm a bit sort of dazed. I think definitely social events. And I think it's true that people aren't aware of each other's cultures enough. And so I think it might be quite a simple idea, but I think if it's quite accessible, I think that's quite a useful idea. And I think that's more one-to-one, person-to-person, face-to-face kind of relationship. Yeah. Is that enough?
Racism.
Okay, well, one way of tackling racism is to come together as we have today to really address these issues and understand how we can work together in a lot more coordinated way, because there's so many great forms of creativity, but coordination is one of the big issues. And I was really impressed by ideas around getting a resource directory where people can actually get all their skills in an online directory or even an app, and really have it accessible to especially young people. So young people out there, if you want to develop an app that helps in harnessing all the skills and abilities to put race back on the agenda, and of course how we address these things in a more coordinated fashion. And also, as chair of the Black Police Association Charitable Trust, you know, we know that people come to us for help, and we will always be helping members of the community, especially when it comes to major incidences, critical incidences. So, you know, giving back is really important, giving it time, and I think how we've done that today shows that there's a lot of energy. We need to make sure that energy comes out of the room and is being applied in an individual basis wherever we live, where we work, where we socialise, and also collectively through solidarity and self-organisation.